Should we start now? But not many people online, that's why.
It's up to you. We can start anytime. I'm
Let
fine
us
with it.
wait just 5 minutes more. Let us
Okay.
wait.
Okay, sure. Sure.
Hello, we are starting our third lecture on decolonization of knowledge and decolonial pedagogy, looking back and moving forward. This actually is one of its kind, probably we're doing it from Kolkata, India, Sister Nivedita University, that this has not been discussed in India specifically, though being the classically colonized country, and it is still an underdeveloped area. Compared to that, decolonization and decoloniality have been discussed in Latin America, in America, in Southeast Asia, other countries. We actually learning things from them. In fact, personally speaking, Professor Alatas was the only one, and Walter Mignolo, that who actually reigned in my imagination, academic imagination, when I read the work of criticism, criticizing Marx on India. They were the one actually led the later part of me while I start writing on other things also, even in gender, that we understand that decolonizing gender is also part of the thing. So we have intersectional feminism. Now, this particular area actually is very much needed for real practical purposes. That is, what policy should we take in independent, now that we are formally independent, what policy we should take in case of decoloniality, specifically education, the classic backbone of making people understanding their own worldviews and others' worldviews. So we haven't been really developed in decoloniality in India. So with this particular series, this is my submission that I would like, of course, globally and locally also, people to learn from scholars like Professor Alatas, who actually I could consider mentor in this case. And more practically and more recently, Professor Alatas is the one who helped me in organizing this series. So a special thank you and tribute to you, sir. I could not have done it without you. So thank you very much again for coming to my help. Let me just give a brief introduction because it has to be very brief. For that reason, because if I start telling about Alatas, it would be a problematic matter. So I should not actually do that. I will just read about Alatas from my brief introduction. Before I go to Professor Alatas's introduction, I'd like to mention that I met Professor Alatas's father, Syed Hussein Alatas, in India, in Jammu in 2005, when he came as a panel speaker and also a special lecture to give to us. And we came to learn about that things are happening. And he was one of those whom I also read. So I'm eternally grateful what you are going to say. Alatas family. Let me now give a brief introduction. Syed Farid Alatas critiques the dominance of Western-centric perspectives in social sciences and advocates for an autonomous social science tradition that incorporates non-Western thought and perspectives. Alatas extensively analyzes how colonial ideologies continue to influence knowledge production and dissemination even after formal decolonization. He highlights the concept of intellectual imperialism where Western knowledge systems are presented as universal and superior, marginalizing other intellectual traditions. Actually, this is the point of importance I think people should take, that intellectual imperialism continues. Alata's works have been highly influential in shaping the field of decolonial studies and promoting a more critical and inclusive approach to social science. His work has inspired a generation of scholars to challenge Eurocentric perspectives and to explore alternative ways of understanding and theorizing social phenomena. He continues to be a leading voice in discussions about decolonizing knowledge and promoting intellectual independence in the global south. And I have already said my personal debt to Professor Alatas. And we are now waiting to hear what Professor Alatas will say. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhadra, for your very nice, kind introduction. Before I begin, can I just ask how many minutes roughly would you like me to speak for?
Minimum 60 minutes maximum.
Again?
60 minutes minimum. If you want 50 minutes and 60 minutes maximum.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I think I won't take that long. Maybe about 40 minutes or so. So there's time for discussion. Okay, and can you hear me well enough?
Very clear, very clear.
Yeah. Okay, right. Thank you.
I'll say 8 more minutes so that we are in reach.
Yeah, all right. Okay. So I would actually like to speak about what we mean by decolonizing knowledge, and I'd like to be quite specific about it. In other words, I want to talk about how we actually, how we may go about decolonizing knowledge. The reason why I'm thinking about this is because I've noticed that, during the last years, in all the years that we talk about decolonizing knowledge, many students, especially graduate students, they understand the critique of Eurocentrism in the social sciences, in sociology, anthropology, and so on. They understand the critique. They understand the Eurocentric biases, but they don't necessarily understand how we go about constructing new knowledge that is not founded on those biases. And also, I also realized that many students and even young scholars are not clear about the full extent of the problem of Eurocentrism. It's not just about biases. There are several other characteristics of Eurocentric knowledge that need to be understood. So this is what I want to talk about. So I'd like to make a few points. Why do we need to decolonize knowledge is one. And the other is the process or the aspects of decolonizing knowledge. What do we actually mean by decolonizing knowledge? And I will be saying that decolonizing knowledge is both about the critique of colonial knowledge or the coloniality of knowledge, but it is also about construction. So I'll speak about anti-colonial thought, the critique part, as well as about construction, which is the constructive part of decolonizing knowledge. And then I will conclude with some remarks about what we actually need to do in terms of practice. So this is basically what I'm going to discuss this afternoon. Now, so the first point, why decolonize knowledge? The reason is simply because we are still in a state of coloniality when it comes to knowledge production. And I'm using coloniality of knowledge more or less synonymously with the Eurocentricity of knowledge. So when we say that knowledge is colonial in nature, or continues to be colonial in nature long after, decades after political independence in the global south, we are also saying that knowledge continues to be Eurocentric. Now, apart from that, we also have to recognize that it is not only knowledge that is colonial or Eurocentric, but the very world itself is colonial or Eurocentric. The world continues to be in a state of coloniality, even though most of the global south, the vast majority of countries or areas in the global south have achieved political or formal independence. But we only have to look at various aspects of how we live our lives. The fact that the entire world has to use the US dollar, which we take for granted, but it's a very strange thing. Why is it that one country, has the privilege of the rest of the world using its currency, which means that that country can just print its currency, and the political economy, international relations, the functioning of international organizations like the United Nations are very much controlled by a small group of countries. One country, United States, for example, can sanction the rest of the world, and the world has to take heed. The United States can impose tariffs on the rest of the world to the detriment of other countries, and we can say to some extent the same is true of the power and influence of parts of Europe. We should also mention that you also have traditional colonialism still around, because not all countries have been decolonized. You have a movement in Puerto Rico, which wants to liberate itself from U.S. Being a U.S. Possession or colony. There are other Falkland Islands remains a British colony, and of course, one of the vivid examples of ongoing colonialism is the case of Palestine. We're speaking about Israel as a settler colonial state. So my point really is that the question of decolonization is not just a question of knowledge production, but also the world itself. And there's a relationship between coloniality or Eurocentricity of knowledge and the coloniality or Eurocentricity of the world, because there is a great there's a relationship in the sense that colonial or Eurocentric knowledge functions in part to veil or justify the coloniality of the world. In other words, knowledge production has an ideological function to maintain the status quo, and part of this status quo is a colonial, capitalist, largely androcentric, male biased, and white-oriented world. And that is the way the world functions. And a lot of knowledge that is created in the social sciences, perhaps less so in sociology and anthropology, but more so in political science, in international relations, in economics, certainly. A lot of knowledge in the social sciences functions to either veil or justify the current order. So I think for these reasons, we have to be serious about the decolonization of knowledge. So I would take the view that decolonization is not merely an option; it is something that we should take seriously. because it's about doing good social science. It's about doing good social science, and it's about doing social science that is not only good for knowledge production, but it is good for our lives. So that my position with regard to decolonizing knowledge is not the same position I would take with regard to the choice of theoretical frameworks. I mean, I think it's not possible to say that one should adopt everyone should adopt a certain theoretical framework. This is a matter of conviction. It's a matter of how one perceives reality. It's a matter of one's choice and so on. So this is fine. But I wouldn't say the same thing for decolonization. I don't think it's something that is a matter of opinion. I think it's something that those of us who live in the global South should take seriously. And to opt for decolonization of knowledge is not to opt for any particular theoretical framework, because within the whole orientation of decolonizing knowledge, there are many perspectives, points of view, experiences, and indeed theories. So this is the first point that I'm making, the case for decolonizing knowledge. Now, the second point will be more elaborate, and this has to do with what we actually mean by decolonization. And here I'm speaking about the decolonization of knowledge. What we actually mean by decolonization, in the way I look at it, is that there is the critique part and there is the construction part. And I think for many years, for many decades, in fact, since certainly in the case of much of Asia and Africa, since the political independence, many scholars in Asia and Africa in the various social sciences and humanities spoke about the need to be intellectually independent of the colonizer or the former colonizers. They spoke of the need to decolonize, or to indigenize, or to nationalize knowledge. And there were various critiques of Eurocentrism. But I think there was little attempt to go into the intricacies. In fact, it is only recently that a few scholars had begun to speak about anti-colonial knowledge or anti-colonial thought. And now that raises the question as to what is the place of anti-colonial thought within the larger project of decolonizing knowledge. And this is something that I had recently been interested in talking about. So I understand decolonization of knowledge to consist of three aspects or three dimensions. I don't want to say levels, because I don't think one is more important than the other. So for me, decolonization involves critique, which I would understand as anti-colonial thought or anti-Eurocentric thought. And then you have construction. So I'd like to say a few words about both of these dimensions of decolonizing knowledge. Now, first of all, let's talk about anti-colonial thought. Now, anti-colonial thought is something quite complex, because it involves, if you think about how long Asia, Africa, and Latin America had been colonized, we're talking about 500 years. I'm speaking about European colonization. Now, the question of whether there was colonization before European colonization is another matter. But if we just confine ourselves to European colonization, this would have begun with the Spanish and Portuguese conquests of the Americas. So we're talking about the 15th century until today. right? So we have 500 years of colonization, which means we have almost 500 years of anti-colonial thought, which we've, really only begun um, uh, to identify. I think we all know, of course, that there has been anti-colonial thought, but I think in most cases we have been interested, or we have identified anti-colonial thought beginning from the 19th century. Like in the case of India, we're familiar with many thinkers such as Ram Mohan Roy. You have Dadabhai Nauroji, which is who was writing in the early part of the 20th century, and many others. The same is true of the Caribbean, of Latin America, of Southeast Asia, of the Arab world. You have Jamaluddin Afghani from Iran, also writing in the 19th century. So we know much about anti-colonial thought beginning from the 19th century. But what about earlier periods? The 18th century, the 17th century, even the 16th century. So we still have not, I think, um, uh, been able to, we're not thought of identifying the full range of anti-colonial thought that has emerged from Asia, Africa, and Latin America since the colonial period began. Now, apart from identifying the thinkers, there's also another issue, and that issue is understanding anti-colonial thought in terms of the types of colonialism, because there's so many types of colonialism. We can think of at least 4 or 5 types. You have settler colonialism, you have extraction colonialism, you have plantation colonialism, you have internal colonialism, you have semi-colonialism. At least you have these types, if not more. Now, why is it important to identify the types of colonialism? Is because the nature of anti-colonial thought really depends on the kind of colonialism that anti-colonial thought is responding to. So, for example, anti-colonial thought that emerges in the context of plantation colonialism, as we have in the case of Indonesia or Malaya or even India, many parts of Africa, was more concerned with exploitation of indigenous labor. Whereas anti-colonial thought that emerged in the context of settler colonialism is more concerned with the problem of ethnocide or genocide, dispossession from land, and so on and so forth. And the kind of semi-colonialism, of course, generates an entirely different type of critique. Mao Zedong was one who spoke about China before the revolution as a semi-colonial state, and he was concerned with how China had juridical authority or control over its land, but how it was dominated by some of the Western powers in terms of external trade and so on and so forth. So you have a different kind of critique. And again, if you talk about internal colonialism, there will be also a different type of critique. So it's important to be specific about the type of colonialism, and therefore to understand the variety of anti-colonial thought in terms of the types of colonialism that anti-colonial thought is referring to or is responding to. We can also understand different dimensions of anti-colonial thought based on the location of the anti-colonial thinker. When I say location, I mean not geographical location, but more the social political context of the anti-colonial thinker. For example, you have the anti-colonial thought of the colonized during the colonial period, right? But you also have anti-colonial thought of the ex-colonized. That would be us, for example. I come from Malaysia, you come from India, from Pakistan, from Nigeria, and so on and so forth. We all are living in a post-colonial world. Our countries were formerly colonized, and now we are looking back at our history and engaging in anti-colonial thought. And certainly the anti-colonial thought of our ancestors who lived during the colonial period is different from the anti-colonial thought of ourselves living in the post-colonial period. You also have, we should also make a distinction between anti-colonial thought that was normative as opposed to anti-colonial thought that is positive. When I say normative, I mean people during the colonial period who criticized colonialism on moral grounds, that it was wrong, it was bad, it was unethical, as opposed to those who criticized colonialism in terms of its reality, its impact, its political, economic impact, its impact on people's lives, and so on. So I'm referring to normative versus positive critique. It's also interesting to consider critical works against colonialism from among the colonized. From among the colonizer. I think maybe we have less, knowledge about this. There are some very good examples of works that criticize colonialism from among the colonizer. From my part of the world, from Indonesia, you have the famous novel called Max Havelaar. Max Havelaar is a character in a novel written by Edward Douwes Dekker, who was a Dutch colonial officer in Java, in Indonesia, in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century. But he left the colonial service and wrote a novel criticizing colonial policy, looking specifically at the coffee industry and the coffee trade in Indonesia. So, this is an example of anti-colonial in the sense that it was critical of colonialism, not to the extent that the author called for the end of colonialism. But it's very important work because it was critical of colonial policy, and it provided ideas to those Indonesians who were calling for the end of colonialism. So you have this variety or this dimension of anti-colonial thought. I'd like to mention the work of Albert Memmi, who was based in Tunisia, writing in the 1950s, a very important work called The Colonizer and the Colonized, and where when he talks about the colonizer, he makes that distinction between the colonialist who was fully wedded to the colonial enterprise, as opposed to the people from the country of the colonizer, but who some of whom became critical of colonization. So this is something I think interesting. But you can see just from this brief discussion that anti-colonial thought is quite complex. We have 500 years of anti-colonial thought. We have the normative and the positive, and we have varieties of anti-colonial thought depending on the kind of colonialism, the type of colonialism, such as semi-colonialism, settler colonialism, and so on. So that's anti-colonial thought. Now, it's also important, and I'm still on the topic of anti-colonial thought. It's also important for us to understand the traits or the characteristics of coloniality of knowledge, or the Eurocentricity of knowledge. And why it's important is because sometimes it's not at all obvious. If you think about the classical or traditional Orientalism among European scholars and administrators in the colonial period, sometimes their Eurocentrism was very obvious, very blatant. For example, they had derogatory views um, about indigenous people, about locals, right? About Indians, about Malays, about the Chinese, about the Arabs, about the Africans. They had very derogatory views. They referred to them as semi-human or lower in the hierarchy of humanity and so on. So that's obvious, of course. But there there is a great deal of scholarship which remains with us today that continues to be Eurocentric without our necessarily detecting it. Um, for example, um, until today, in many of our um, um, discourses, we continue to refer to 1492 as the discovery of America. I don't know whether that's the case in India, but certainly in many places I've been to, including my own country, when we talk about the history about 1492, we use the phrase "the discovery of America," and this is actually, if you really think about it, it's quite strange. How can that be the discovery of America? It's not the first time that human beings went to America. If it was the first time, we can refer to it as the discovery of America. It's more accurate to refer to it as the European discovery of America because it was a discovery for them, right? Um, of course, as you know better than me, they made a big mistake because they thought they arrived in India, so they call people Indians, and that name has stuck until today. Um, but the issue here is that you have a false universality. The European experience is generalized as the experience of all of humanity. And we can find many examples of that. For example, the celebration of Ferdinand Magellan's voyage, circumnavigation of the globe. This is an example of a false universality, a false universalism. Um, the circumnavigation of the globe is celebrated as a great human feat. It is more accurate to say that it was seen as a great human feat for the Europeans. But from the perspective of people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, we can say that this was a catastrophe. It was a disaster because when Magellan went around the world, when he completed his voyage in 1521, we can say that from 1492, when Christopher Columbus found America for the Europeans, and 1521, that's 30 years, about 30 years, when Magellan found the route around the world, this is when the Europeans know of the whole world, which is not something we would have liked because it prepared the way for colonization, for almost total colonization, which took the process of a few hundred years. So imagine from the perspective of people living in the Philippines, where Magellan arrived, completed his journey in a place called Mactan, which was in what was later to become the Philippines. In fact, Magellan is the one who found the Philippines um, for the Spaniards, and it was named after King Philip, the Spanish king, some decades after Magellan arrived there. So from a point of view of people living in what was later to become the Philippines, this was a terrible thing that these Portuguese had found the route around the world. They would have preferred that none of the Europeans ever made that trip, so that they remain ignorant about the rest of the world. But I think our history. I don't think our textbooks, our history textbooks, reflect that other perspective on that historical event. So you have false universalism. You also have a distortion of reality. The Spaniards and the Portuguese, when they went to America, they distorted history. They distorted reality. they spoke of the natives as primitive people, as people who had no culture, who had no sophisticated religion, or actually no religion, because the only religion in those days, the only religion was Christianity. When you said religion, when you said religio, it meant Christianity and no other faith. So Hinduism for the Europeans in the 16th century was heathenism. If you look at the European dictionaries that go back to even the 17th century, even 18th century, you'll find that you look under the term Hindu, it does not refer to the Hinduism as a religion, but rather as heathenism. And the same was true of the natives of America. They had no sophisticated political system or political thought or statecraft. No, sophisticated ideas on statecraft. So you have this distortion of reality. Now, to sustain that distortion and to sustain the false universalism, there must be a silencing of indigenous or native voices. So that is also part of Eurocentrism. And there are indeed other traits of Eurocentrism or coloniality of knowledge, which we can also discuss. But it is very important when we speak about decolonization of knowledge that we introduce anti-colonial thought as one aspect of decolonizing knowledge, and that anti-colonial thought is something complex. It requires understanding the various traits of the coloniality of knowledge. I've mentioned 3 traits. It also has a history of 500 years, and anti-colonial thought differs based on the kind of colonialism that is involved, and so on and so forth. So that is anti-colonial thought. Now, I'll just take a few minutes because I think I've already spoken for about 40 minutes, yes?
Mr. Alistair, we like
Yes.
to we don't worry about the time.
Okay. Well, I won't take too much
Okay,
too much longer. All right. Now, once we are familiar with anti-colonial thought, and this is something that is a continuous thing. We must always be interested in it, and I think it's going to take many years, maybe even decades, for scholars around Asia, Africa, and Latin America to identify the full range of anti-colonial thought that has emerged during the last 500 years. That is just, one aspect. The other aspect, anti-colonial thought refers to critique. We also need to engage in the construction of new knowledge. So you have critique and you have construction. Now, as far as construction is concerned, I make the distinction between reconstruction and original construction. So when I mean reconstruction, I mean dealing with the existing themes in Eurocentric or colonial knowledge, but offering alternative constructions, alternative interpretations. So, for example, one of the themes in colonial or Eurocentric knowledge was that India, private property is non-existent in India during in pre-colonial times, and that therefore India did not have the prerequisites for the development of capitalism. This was one of Marx's observations about India. And you have Marx's famous you have Marx's famous view that in India has no history. Because what he meant was there were no classes, and therefore no class struggle, and therefore no know history, because history is defined as the movement of as the emergence of conflict that arises from class struggle and class conflict. So when Indian scholars, when Indian historians and economists and sociologists critique that, deal with that theme that's already found in colonial Eurocentric scholarship, they offer alternative interpretations. Then I would refer to that as reconstruction. However, there's also what I would call original construction, and that is where we deal with entirely new themes and even new conceptual concepts and new theoretical frameworks that we develop, particularly from non-Western intellectual traditions. For example, if we develop a method and a theory in comparative religion, in the study of comparative religion, entirely from the work of Al-Biruni, who, as you know, who spent many years in India and studied Sanskrit and studied Indian religions, then this would be more of an original construction. Because to date, in fact, there's no, Al-Birunian theory of religion that has been developed. We know Al-Biruni's work and we cite him, but I don't think we have actually worked on a conceptual framework or a theoretical framework based on his writing. And we can, I think we can think of many thinkers from the Hindu intellectual tradition, from the Islamic intellectual tradition, from the Buddhist traditions, and from other civilizational traditions, whether religion-based or not. That's not the point. But we can think of ideas and thinkers from various other, for non-Western civilizational or religious traditions that can be the basis of new ideas, new concepts, and even theoretical framework. My own work on Ibn Khaldun is an example, I think, of what I would consider original construction. That when you look at Ibn Khaldun, you don't think of him through the lens of European or American historical sociology, but you look at Ibn Khaldun in his own terms, and you construct a framework that can be used to empirically study history. So this would be more of an original construction rather than a reconstruction. So we can say that decolonizing knowledge consists of the identification of anti-colonial thought in all its complexity and varieties. And furthermore, it consists of constructing new knowledge, which means both reconstruction as well as original construction. And if we look at decolonizing knowledge in this way, we can see that our task is very heavy. I mean, we have so much of work to do in the next decades and maybe even centuries. And I say centuries because we have hardly begun to take decolonization seriously. We speak a lot about it in the last years, and I think we've spoken a lot more about decolonization of knowledge in the last 10 or 20 years than we did before that. I think when I was a graduate student, we didn't hear much about decolonization of knowledge, although there was a generation of scholars talking about it and writing about it. You have in the case of India, you had Ashish Nandi, you have T.N. Madan, Yogendra Singh, T.K. Oman, and many others who were talking about it and writing about it. But I think the pace and the intensity is a lot more now than it was during the generation of my father. But we've had very little impact on teaching. very little impact on the um, on the curricula, on course syllabi, on the rewriting of textbooks. I mean, if I just take my field as an example, sociology or sociological theory, there are hardly any textbooks written that on sociological theory, for example, that um, provide a decolonial account of the history of sociological theory, or um, that present social thinkers or social theorists from non-Western intellectual traditions. So we really have a long way to go. I think what I said about sociological theory is also true of anthropological theory, of political theory. The canon is still very much Western, and we haven't done much in terms of disturbing that canon. Yeah. So I think I'll stop here and leave some time for discussion. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Alatas. I told them to write in the chat box. So please see the chat box for the questions. I think I asked for questions, but people are as people they are. They write a long paragraph without framing up. Professor Satyajit Dasgupta, are you there? Who is Satyajit? Ask the question, or rather written the question. Then সত্যজিৎ কোথায় গেল? Unmute করতে হবে. You have to unmute. I have a problem with my audio. He has a problem with the audio, so Professor Alatas, you have to read his long passage, which
Oh,
I don't stand up with.
from Satyajit, is it?
Yeah,
Okay. It's very long, yeah.
yeah, it's a very long one. Instead of the question, is this what? Evaluation. His observation.
Comment here.
He has
Yeah.
specifically requested people to be precise and specific.
No, I think I can see the question here. It says,
Okay,
Gi-
okay.
given the tendentious bid on the part of the current ruling dispensation to use Hindi as their dubiously populist scheme of decolonizing knowledge, what would be considered your considered view on this? Okay, I can't really speak specifically on this issue of using Hindi, but I think this is an opportunity to um, to make a distinction between what I would call genuine decolonization from a kind of nativism. If you um, what has happened in many parts of the world, and I think this has happened in India, it's happened in Malaysia, it's happened in Pakistan, and many other parts. There is a tendency to impose a kind of ethno-religious nationalism, not only in politics but also in knowledge production, but pass it off as decolonization. And this is happening in India for sure. I remember reading a work on history textbooks in Pakistan by K.K. Aziz, and he shows how history textbooks in Pakistan misrepresent Hindus. I mean, to make a long story short, he shows how anything bad that's done in history is done by Hindus, and anything good is done by Muslims, right? But you have the kind of reverse, I think, which is going on in India. In Malaysia, you have a kind of Malay ethno-nationalism that discounts or underplays the role of non-Malays in Malaysian history. And you also have a kind of, related to that, a linguistic linguistic nativism that privileges one language over the other and discourse in that language over discourse in other languages. So you basically what you have is a hijacking of decolonization, hijacking of the ideals of decolonization and people are doing what they claim to be decolonization, but they're actually engaged in a nativistic kind of discourse.
Dr. Gupta has asked you a question in the chat. Can you see that?
How do you distinguish?
How would you distinguish post-colonial from decolonial?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Well, I think when we speak about, I have been speaking about decolonization, not decolonial. Yeah. So for me, decolonization is not a framework or a particular theoretical perspective. It's just a very broad category referring to all attempts that wish to critique coloniality of knowledge or Eurocentricity of knowledge, and that wish to construct new knowledge. This is what I mean by decolonization. Now, among people who want to decolonize, there are many theoretical frameworks. For example, there are many theoretical frameworks or even schools of thought. So, for example, you could say that the subaltern studies school is one example, of a school of thought that wants to decolonize knowledge. The movement in the Philippines to indigenize psychology is an example of wanting to decolonize knowledge, and so on and so forth. Now, post-colonial theory and decolonial thought are two different approaches in the decolonization of knowledge. Decolonial thought is a specific approach or school of thought, sometimes known as what do they call what do they call them? Modernity coloniality project. So it's a school of thought or a perspective that emerged in Latin America. It's largely associated with scholars like Walter Mignolo, Anibal Quijano, and so on. Post-colonial theory is something that is more associated with the British and with Indian scholars, with Edward Said, of course, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak. Its roots are more in literature, in literary criticism, and it's more interested, or it's rather it comes out of discourse about the 19th century, colonialism in the 19th century. Decolonial thought, I think, is more rooted in the social sciences, especially sociology and historical sociology, political economy, and it takes its discourse seems to take the problem of coloniality further back to the 16th century. So decolonial scholars, talk about the conquest of America, and so on and so forth. So these are, just some ideas about the difference between decolonial thought and post-colonialism. You should read. There's a very good short essay, but very good essay by Gurminda Bambra on the distinction between decolonial thought and post-colonialism.
There are more questions in the chat box.
Okay. So from Chandni Basu, would you say that young people have much to offer in terms of new frameworks and lens? Okay, I will say no. Okay, but before you get angry at me, not that young people don't have anything to offer, but what I mean is it's not a matter of youth. I think both young people as well as old people, like Professor Bhadra and myself, we are both old, yes? But I wouldn't say we have less to offer, right? So it's not a matter of whether we are old like myself or or you are young. I'm assuming you are one of the young people you're referring to. It's a matter of our orientation. It's a matter of our our interest, our commitment. And I would also say one thing. It's a matter of whether we have shame. You know, do we have shame? Do we have a sense of shame that we are alienated, in our education system from our own intellectual traditions? If we have that sense of shame, then we want to do something about it. We want to reconnect with, our own intellectual traditions. And not just necessarily our own tradition. I'm not saying that if one is Hindu, you should be interested in only in the Hindu tradition. If you're Muslim, you should only be interested in the Muslim tradition. But as you know, as people from the global South, why do we confine our interest to the Western Anglo-American intellectual tradition? Why not broaden our source of ideas? Why not be inspired by the rest of humanity? So as a Malaysian, why would I not be interested in Russian thought? Why would I not be interested in Hindu thought? Why would I not be interested in Latin American thought? So unless we feel a deficiency that we confine ourselves to the Western intellectual tradition, if we do not feel that deficiency, then we are never going to think in terms of, as you say, offering new frameworks and lens. And feeling this deficiency is not to do with our age. It's got to do with our orientation. It's got to do with the realization. And we may be young or old and come to that realization. Professor Badra, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you by saying you're old, but I'm old too. We are all old.
There seems to be a lot of interest. That's good. So you can ask these questions. Zini, I have a question of how does narrative and knowledge form? The margins play an important role in your understanding of society.
I'm sorry. Where is the?
Um,
Is that right at the bottom? No.
Not at the bottom.
Oh, Zini, yeah. I have a question of how does narratives and knowledge from the margins play important role in understanding society? Oh, yeah, of course, definitely. I think you see the very fact that we speak about decolonization, it means we are talking about the marginalization of uh, colonial or ex-colonial voices. So we are, by definition, we are interested in the margins. But those margins can be understood in a broad sense, not just marginal in terms of having been colonized, but all kinds of marginality. It means marginality according to class, according to ethnicity, according to religion, according to gender. So I think if we are genuinely, decolonial in our way of thinking, then we should be concerned with all kinds of marginality, including what Chandni Basu refers to as ageism. Yeah, that's also a form of marginalization. So definitely. Mm. Okay.
The same way they discuss India, Africa, Latin America.
Sorry, I'm just trying to look at these questions.
before Zin, uh, before Zin, would you say that young people have much to offer in terms of leadership?
Yeah, okay. I think I've answered that about the young people. So I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Professor Badra.
Which were talking in terms of all youth. They have new framework and lens. How would they? They are different themselves. They're a diversified group. Class, language, colonial, decolonial, gender, nation, ability, disability, and you're not considering the sociological factors. So I'm sorry. I find this is an essentializing position, like orientalizing. All Indians were semi-barbaric or semi-Greeks. Not all Indians were that semi-barbaric. We had one of the first urban civilizations. In fact, maybe not understanding, I do not know. I thought that I could feel provoked to answer that, and I'll take up Shotanit also for a minute. Shotanit, you're not asking the question. What Professor Alatas is actually trying to tell you. Professor Alatas is saying decolonization, the typology of one of its beauty of this lecture of Professor Alatas is he's not making decolonization as a holistic, essentialistic question. He has diversified different types of decolonization of knowledge. That whatever we do is not decolonization. Whatever we do is not anti-colonial. And we have to understand the strains and the strands and the difference between them. Otherwise, we will be talking like real successor of the colonial people. It was the habit of the colonial people to actually essentialize. And that is why the Orient came, the developing country, the third world, now global south. So I think don't miss the point of Professor Alatas. I mean, that is the purpose of it. Professor Alatas, you are now free from my mentioned Laura formulated the question about the Maori approach in Linda went with decolonizing methodologies and decolonizing.
Yes. Before that, I'm just trying to go one by one. The question from Satyajit, the second part of the question, do you think generation of biographic data could emerge? Say again?
I have answered that. You can please go to Laura Coradita.
Okay.
Next one.
Okay. Would I add the Maori approach in Linda Tuhiwai Smith's decolonizing methodologies and decolonial feminism? Yes, of course, definitely. Although, decolonial feminism, it is a decolonizing approach, but it's dealing with two problems. We have to remember that. The decolonial part is dealing with coloniality of knowledge or Eurocentricity of knowledge. The feminist part is dealing with the androcentricity of knowledge. And when it comes to knowledge production in the social sciences and humanities, there are many hegemonic orientations. We have been talking about colonialism or Eurocentrism as the hegemonic orientation, but there are other hegemonic orientations. Sometimes they are independent of Eurocentrism. For example, androcentrism, ethno-nationalism, sectarianism, and so on and so forth. This is something that I've interested in myself, and I've written about it. But the point is, we are interested in decolonizing knowledge, but let's not imagine that colonialism or coloniality of knowledge or Eurocentricity of knowledge is the only problem, the only hegemonic orientation as far as knowledge production is concerned. So what is next, Professor Bhadra?
Professor Thakur, the founder of the Nivedita University, is here. He wants to ask you a question.
Sure.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, my first question was, when you have cultural imperialism, how would that be related to the decolonialism? Because the cultural imperialism quite often happens because a minority group is subjected to the cultural hegemony of the majoritarian group. And this has happened without the colonial imperialist colonialism that we are talking about. We have defined 4 types of coloniality, but I thought this would be something that I would like to know. The second question would be, essentially, when we are talking about the hard science, and here I'm deeply interested because I dabbled into it throughout my life. When we go to the teaching part of a decolonized understanding of these kind of concepts, how much are we yet prepared to move away from, say, in chemistry, we talk about Lavoisier, the alchemist, and then transiting into chemistry per se as a science. But there have been other kind of civilizational approach. One of the famous book being Hindu Chemistry by P.C. Ward, where he defines how the chemistry evolved in a pre-Lavoisier period, which is non-European. But these are the texts which does not appear in the standard format of an undergraduate textbook or in the postgraduate form. This is relegated only to the research areas. There have been research papers, but nothing into the substantial understanding of the knowledge being promoted in the 21st century. So these are the questions.
Thank you very much for the question. I think the second one especially, I think, is important but also difficult to deal with. With regard to cultural imperialism, so this has to do with the context within which knowledge creation takes place. The whole world literally is integrated in terms of knowledge creation. It's basically American, British, and to some extent French educational systems, and even the content of education, the textbooks, the writings, the books, the articles, which are spread throughout the world. And are used in universities, if we confine ourselves to universities. So what you have, and this has been written about by scholars since the 1960s, you have this phenomenon of intellectual imperialism. Intellectual imperialism is a structure in which we operate. It has certain characteristics and certain traits. And intellectual imperialism is part of the larger phenomenon of cultural imperialism. But there are interesting differences. I think cultural imperialism is uneven in terms of how it spreads and how it operates. So if you look at cuisine, let's say if you take food culture as opposed to intellectual culture, cultural imperialism is far less dominant or effective in terms of the food culture in India, as opposed to cultural imperialism in terms of the dominance of Western forms of knowledge in tertiary education. I mean, you still find the various Indian cuisines around India as dominant. In general, you do not find Indians giving up their cuisine for Western cuisine, and of course there are many reasons for that. I think the same thing is true of music. Traditional genres of music, as well as modernized versions of traditional genres, are still very much alive. music, dance forms, and so on. But you don't find the same case, the same situation when it comes to knowledge creation. There's a great deal more attrition of the intellectual traditions when in comparison to the culinary traditions or the musical traditions. So cultural imperialism is, unevenly develops over the centuries, beginning with the colonial period. But I think so. Decolonization of knowledge takes place within the larger context of intellectual imperialism, which is an aspect of cultural imperialism. Now, when we talk about construction, especially when we talk about original construction, I think the second question of yours is related to the issue of original construction. I think original construction is a very complex issue which we've not really talked much about, but we can see that original construction involves different levels of originality, and it also has to be understood in terms of the degree to which we remain within the Western sphere, the Euro-American sphere of knowledge production. What I mean is this: if you take, let's say, anthropology or sociology, there are already established fields within anthropology and sociology. Let us say the study of migration. But the contribution in terms of original constructions would be for us to come up with local or indigenous understandings of the movement of peoples. So, for example, in Tamil Nadu, presumably, if you look at historical records, historical accounts, you look at folklore, you look at literature dating back to pre-colonial times, you can figure out how people understood migration or movement of people. And there you have the possibility of conceptualizing ideas, conceptualizing certain realities from the way people understood these things. And then those concepts can then be brought into modern anthropological or sociological studies of migration. But what you're doing is you are taking an already established field within modern anthropology or modern sociology, but you are drawing upon traditional knowledge or a traditional, an intellectual tradition, a non-Western intellectual tradition. But this is one way of engaging in construction of new knowledge. But what you're suggesting is a more, a different level of constructing new knowledge, where you take not just an idea or a concept from a non-Western intellectual tradition, but you take the whole field of study. You take, for example, Ayurvedic medicine, right? Ayurvedic practices, or traditional Chinese medicine, or Tib Yunani, the traditional Islamic medical practice. You take the field as a whole, and perhaps you don't even think of integrating it into modern Western medicine, but you think of creating or developing a field based on traditional Chinese medicine, for example, parallel to the Western system. Or you think of integrating Western medical knowledge and practices into the traditional medical system. And to give an example from Ibn Khaldun, my own work on Ibn Khaldun, I try to create, to construct Khaldunian sociology from his work in his own terms, rather than reading him through Western sociology or to Western historical sociology. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to do the latter. I think it's also legitimate to look at Ibn Khaldun through the lens of Marx or Weber. But I think it's also legitimate to understand Ibn Khaldun in his own terms. And a third way is to integrate Ibn Khaldun to integrate Marx and Weber and Ibn Khaldun into a theoretical framework. So you see, these are all different possible ways of decolonizing knowledge, different types of creativity. And I'm not privileging one over the other. You know, to take an analogy from food, it's possible and we do it all the time, to cook using only Indian spices or the spices that have been part of Indian culinary tradition for generations or for centuries. It's perfectly possible to do that, and one can can create very nutritious and interesting and tasty dishes just by remaining with your coriander and cumin and turmeric and so on and so forth. But many chefs are very creative and they want to bring in spices and ingredients from other civilizations. This is being done all the time. In the West, in what they call fusion cuisine, they are doing this all the time. So it's a matter of, to me, it's a matter of being open to the wide range of traditions, of civilizational traditions, and using what you're interested in using. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Sorry, you are talking, but I'm trying to speak so that everyone is after. First question is after. Now, this is Dhritiman. Let me read it to you. This has been given in the native, so thanks for it. My main concern is how to characterize, define thoughts which creatively engage with European canon and works for subversion from which this time. And people have geography, but when we do comparative studies, we tend to overlook it. Post-colonial avoided the question of political for very long. So when we do comparative studies, we apparently deny or that there is whatever the problem is, the political has not been discussed. I
okay.
understand the question much. If you understood, go ahead.
Okay.
Here.
Okay. This is from Dhritiman, yeah?
Right.
Yeah. My main concern is how to characterize thoughts which create engagement. Okay. Okay. I'm not if I understand correctly, the issue is how do we understand what's our attitude, or what should our attitude be towards engaging with the European canon and subverting the canon from within? I mean, definitely. I think this is important. In fact, it's also my approach, because in a book that I co-authored with my colleague Vinita Sinha, it's called Sociological Theory Beyond the Canon, and this is really what we do. We critique the. Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, so we critique the canon. We look at Marx and Weber and Durkheim, for example. We critique their Eurocentricity, and we offer a non-Eurocentric reading of them, but we go beyond the critique of the canon. I think maybe this is the point, yeah? We go beyond the critique of the canon, we go beyond the critique of Eurocentric authors to provide alternatives. So Vinita herself writes about, in that book, she writes about Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, and yeah, and I write about Jose Rizal and Ibn Khaldun. So we try to present alternatives to the canon, looking at non-Western thinkers, and Vinita introduces women thinkers as well, women founders of social thought and social theory. Yeah, so this is what needs to be done, I feel.
Next, let us go to Chanda Datta's question. Professor, a little two, three after, because these are second questions, so I'm overriding them. Chanda Datta's question is, Professor Alatas, thank you for an insightful lecture. We are often in a dilemma in terms of linguistic usage. On the one hand, we are trying to decolonize language by remaining indigenous, while on the other, we are often proactively upholding the significance of foreign languages, especially English. But there is a clash and crisis. How can we address that?
Yeah, this is a frequently raised, this issue of language. And I note here that you say foreign languages, but I mean, I really wonder whether English is after so many decades and centuries, is it a foreign language in India, or even in my country, Malaysia, or in many African countries? I wonder whether it is a foreign language.
Because we have 150 crores in India. So I don't know, the statistics is never given properly, but I don't think not more than 10 to 15 crores of people actually can really converse.
Yeah. No, so I think there's a
The 10% would be a large number.
And the large number
It is the 10% of 150 crore. It would be a very large number, and there would be a large number of other languages which are indigenous, but certainly carry lesser number of people.
Yeah. So I would want to make the distinction between the problem of language, the problem of communication, as opposed to the problem of of thinking, of ideas. So it's important to have discourse in other languages, because people who don't know a particular language, but they know their own language, there must be a discourse in social science, so that people can engage in such a discourse if they don't know English, but even if they don't know Hindi or other more mainstream languages. So this is the issue of communication. But there's another reason why languages are important, indigenous languages or local languages are important, because languages are sources of ideas. Languages are repositories of concepts. A language cannot be confined to its utility for translating from English or other European languages to your own language. We cannot confine our languages to that role. Languages are repositories of concepts and ideas. But having said that, the use of English itself is not problematic in that it predisposes us to thinking colonially or in a Eurocentric manner. I think we can all we can all see that one cannot know a word of English and be thoroughly Eurocentric in your own language. You can read works in the social sciences in a local language, which is 100% Eurocentric. On the other hand, a lot of decolonizing mentalities and attitudes and works are available in English or in French. So I don't think English has a power independent of the mind or the orientation of the people using the language.
With the advent of AI, viewed this kind of problem in 2 decades time.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
With the advent of AI, the simultaneous translation being available fairly accurately, will this kind of communication problem become less in 2 decades time?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question.
Aspect of technology.
That's a good question. I think AI can, I have some experience. I use AI sometimes just to to see how things can be translated. What I realize is AI is good in terms of translating. Um, it's good in terms of the grammatical aspect of translation, but not when it comes to concepts. Um, because AI doesn't seem to have that that nuanced ability to translate a concept accurately. So it may take a certain concept, let's say, uh, um, let's say society. The word society can be translated, into a certain foreign language, a non-English language, let's say, but you would not know whether it used a term in that language from from the intellectual tradition of that language, or a newly created um, word that was created in the modern period in order to accommodate modern social science. You wouldn't know that. So I think I don't think AI has reached a stage where it can actually accurately translate. To give an example, I refer to something that Professor Badra had raised in a discussion a few weeks ago about how caste is used to translate jati or varna. And she was making the point that this is not proper or correct translation. But then AI because it is widely translated that way. Varna is widely translated as caste. Then of course AI would do the same.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
My question, I'm S.S. Bhattacharya. I raised a question regarding the grammatical tradition. Professor Bhadra,
Yeah, please,
there was a question.
more or less. The first question of the serial. To give us time.
Hello.
Yes.
Now, I have raised a question. Just your reaction, I wanted to get it. That is about the Indian grammatical tradition of Panini and many other grammarians, which was completely indigenous. And then it was almost kind of suppressed by the colonial tradition. Now, what is your opinion about it?
I mean, you're asking what is my opinion about it being suppressed?
Yes.
Uh,
The really an indigenous knowledge available to us.
okay, you are just giving one example, but entire intellectual traditions have been suppressed in so many fields, right? In so many fields.
True.
Yeah.
But
So
which was a very developed one,
yeah,
appreciated by the many European scholars.
yeah,
But the tradition was not maintained.
yeah. That's right. But essentially, this is the problem. I mean, our problem is to recover these traditions. Um, our problem is to familiarize ourselves, to identify what was suppressed, and to recover them. And of course, what to identify and what to recover depends on our interests. It depends on what individual scholars or even institutions like universities or research centers or publishers. It depends on what we are interested in. That will determine what we recover and what we identify to be recovered. Um, I'm not really concerned with specific traditions, but what I'm saying is we have to develop this orientation or this mindset where we desire to recover these traditions. Which specific traditions are recovered is a matter of our own personal or institutional interests.
As chair of this talk, what I'm doing is trying to give the first question to Professor Alatas first of everyone. So somebody jumping in and asking question makes it difficult. So you have to have a little bit of patience, may I say that. Now, Devasubha Chattopadhyay. Almost a lot of people have 2 questions, but we may not be able to, afford the time, so to speak. And the questions are never, short, precise. They are almost long notes. I guess that's the Indian tradition, I would say, most of the time. Devasubha Chattopadhyay. I'm getting rid of good afternoon and your excellent lecture. Everybody wrote that. As a student of sociology, you should avoid this kind of thing. We don't want to know who you are. My question is, what is the scope of decolonizing the existing Western frameworks? My mind, in the theoretical tradition of sociology, which we continue to teach and practice in our universities.
Yeah.
Whole
Yeah.
world. Western frameworks. Why the hell you teach? My question is back to you all. You are young people. Why the hell you teach? Why the hell you don't protest? Because you will not get promotion. So that's the practical answer. Do anything to teach your own things. Now, Professor Alatas, it's for you.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, of course, there is great scope to decolonize the Western frameworks. In terms of what I said, critiquing the coloniality of these Western frameworks, of these Western, theories, concepts, methods, but also engaging in reconstruction. In a sense, you could say that Mao Zedong's ideas, his discussion on dialectics, on contradiction, or his more empirical discussions on the Chinese class structure in the countryside, is a decolonization of Western Marxist framework, and I think there's a lot of scope for that. But at the same time, we must go beyond, critiquing and expanding the Western framework. We need to go beyond that to take an interest in our own intellectual traditions. This is the best thing to do. So again, going back to the analogy of food, by all means, take an interest in Western food, and modify it, add to it. For example, in many cases, in many culinary traditions, they take spaghetti, but they make the spaghetti sauce with completely different spices, not the standard spices that are used or herbs that are used in Italy. That's fine to do, but then you don't remain there. You also continue to develop your own culinary traditions. So I think this is something that we need to be very clear about. The scope of decolonizing existing Western framework is very broad. There's a lot of scope, but don't remain at that level of just critiquing and expanding the Western framework.
Okay, we have a question from our friend Caroline from Philippines. Dear Professor Hari, thanks so much for this very insightful lecture, and thanks a lot for Professor Bhadro for organizing. Thank you, Caroline. I'd like to ask what specific steps do you derive from graduate training in Global South countries? In Global South, what decolonization means specifically for supporting students in writing term paper, journal article, thesis, etc., for conceptualizing graduate courses?
Yeah. Hello, Carolina. Thank you for attending and for your question. It's a good question, because I've not really encountered it before. I suppose my answer would be that it's not something we can do it's not something we can accomplish within the confines of the formal institution. In other words, when you teach graduate students, when I teach graduate students, I don't see the students all the time. I may see them in one or two courses, and that's it. And you can't do much. In terms of doing this decolonization in one or two courses. It's different if you are working with an advisee, then you spend more time with the student. But what I'm saying is this: I think most of decolonization will happen outside of the formal institution. In other words, if you have students or others who are not your students in the university, but they are from other universities or they're from other they are from other places, other institutions. I think having reading groups, where you are thematizing decolonization, and then you are spending years with the student, even after they graduate, or you have students who are not your students, but they attend your reading groups. But the point is, you're spending years where you are reading material. So what I lectured on just now about the different types of anti-colonial thought and original construction and deconstruction. This is something that you continuously talk about, and you talk about these things in the context of certain books and certain articles that you are reading, and you're doing a close reading of these things. I think this is how we can do it. So it's not something that can be done in a course. You do it, you discuss it in a course, and then you don't see the student anymore. The student doesn't meet you anymore. That's not going to actually really result in a kind of rigorous training in the decolonization of knowledge. This is something that can be done in the university, but must also be done outside of the formal institution.
Okay, next question is Professor Indira Ghosh. AI application shows that we need to have communicating languages, not just one preferred. What is your comment on this?
Yes, I agree. There have to be more languages. Definitely the case. But you see, for me, decolonization is not just about communication. Obviously, communication is important, and I mean, just the fact that I don't really. I would guess that most of the discourse on decolonizing is in English. Well, that's not fair to say, because I'm sure there's a lot going on in Spanish, for example. But at least, let's say in Southeast Asia and in West Asia, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, I would hazard a guess that most of it is going on in English. You can tell me better. I mean, is there more discourse on decolonizing knowledge in English in India than in Tamil or Hindi or other languages? So communication in other languages is important, but that's only the beginning. It's no use communicating in Hindi or Tamil or Telugu if we're still speaking in a Eurocentric manner, right? So what is important is thinking in a decolonial way, and you can think in a decolonizing way in any language, including English. So we need to be clear about that distinction.
Yes, but that is, I hope you can hear me. I'm a data scientific point of view I'm talking about. What we notice, the major bias studies are done and many fake things comes. It is because most of the AIs are run on Eurocentric systems. Hence, there is no leverage for or no scope for indigenous languages. I mean, it's not necessary only Maori or something. Even developed languages like even Hindi or Tamil and Bengali, for that matter, because huge amount of literature and informations available also on them.
Mm.
However, we are so Eurocentric, so we develop things called natural language processing. But actually, this natural is not natural language processing. It's Eurocentric language processing.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed, you are 100% correct. And you know which languages are dominating AI? I mean, scientists and some technologists could be jumping for AI.
Yes.
We be absolutely helpless social scientists actually do not do that. Because see which language is coming here. English, French, Spanish, and a little Portuguese. You know, these are the major core. And English, England being the core, still controlling with North America. Don't think, and if some scientists think for a split moment that AI will actually eliminate discrimination in language, he or she is in full paradise. Because this domination will continue also in AI. Because who is making AI? The God? No.
The Chinese are also.
Chinese are also. Chinese is the developed West.
Yes.
Keep shouting over India because the more you control, Bengali, Hindi, Gujarati, Tamil, Andhra, they have more power to control. It's very where colonialism is gone, but imperialism is not gone. It's not from the toothpaste we use to the mosquito. So the coloniality remains. That's why AI is also there. Coloniality is Walter Mignolo and Paul Quizan. That colonialism is gone, that coloniality dominates. Let us go to the next question because Professor Shomala Dr. Gupta, he happens to be my teacher. So I'm slightly favorable to the position that, is he there? Sir, apni achen? Are you there?
Yes.
Very achen. Acha, then there is no point question, second question. Okay, so if there is no more question, can we conclude? The elders should
I am very much here.
Oh, sir, sorry. Okay.
Yes.
You were about to jump your
No, no, no.
Let me go back to you. Professor Dr. Gupta is asking the question, how do you no, that's the first question. Sorry, you have a second question.
What's the second question?
Yeah, he has a second question. Since he works on it a little bit and also came here as our give lecture on decolonization.
Ask Professor Dr. Gupta to
Yeah,
the question.
sir, could you ask the question directly?
Second question.
Other than your second question.
Yes, my second question was that this binary of East and West, I think that needs to be broken. And because if our concern is this, that is knowledge is sovereign, then Eastern knowledge or Western knowledge, if one looks at it like this, then that will give rise to Eurocentrism or say Indocentrism or Sinocentrism like this. So how to break this binary of East and West? How to achieve this syncretic understanding of the knowledge of the East and the knowledge of the West?
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's important. We should not be thinking in binary terms. The problem is not East and West for me.
Exactly.
The problem is hegemony of certain knowledge communities. So when it comes to Eurocentrism, it is not really a Western hegemony. It's the hegemony of a few countries. Institutions in mainly America, Britain, to some extent France. So it's not the entire West. And even when you speak about America, academic institutions in America, France, and and United Kingdom, we need to make that distinction between the hegemony, the hegemony of Eurocentric ideas, as opposed to Euro-American perspectives, which are, of course, legitimate and valid. So the problem is hegemony. And then in our own societies, that, as I mentioned earlier, we are subject to our local hegemonies, like ethno-nationalism and so on and so forth. So our task really is what my father referred to as trying to achieve autonomy. He spoke of the need for an autonomous social science tradition, autonomy from any hegemonic orientation, not just Eurocentrism. So, I myself try not to use this binary East and West. I mean, after all, that binary itself is Eurocentric. It doesn't mean anything. What does East mean? We're just against hegemonies.
Okay, thank you. Thank
Professor
you.
Badra. What happened to Professor Bhadra?
Hold on. I guess there's nobody has any questions, so I'm taking the advantage of 2-3 minutes I can ask you. I don't
Okay.
Very clearly, when we discuss Eurocentrism or Orientalism or cultural imperialism or colonialism for that matter, we still refer or has to refer or have to go through that North, South, Orient, Occident, developing, first world, third world, now global North, global South, then South, South, North, North. Well, it's actually the mentality, historically, the mentality actually shown that we are used to division since we got civilized. It is like a property and class society, etc. So point is that I don't think there is any plan can be given to any country that this is the way to decolonize, or you can start using, you could practice decoloniality in education, in health, in medicine, in everything. I don't think there is any guided path or any kind of chartered pathways you can take. I think we have to realize that we are free but not free. And that unfreedom, sense of unfreedom has to come from us. See, in India, somebody getting an American degree is a status holder. And even in selection committees, selectors feels, selectors from India mostly or one from outside India feels, confused that what to do with 2 foreign degrees and 3 Indian degrees. What has to be done? They are not discussing the merit of the work you have done. They are discussing the degree itself. A degree is a degree from anywhere, doesn't matter. But until and unless the selection committee learns, that means the government learns how to recruit people to discuss what they have done and how qualitative it is. Our selection committees in universities are just done, you are a professor, you are a selector, you are an associate professor, you are not a selector. So that's what happens, that you have specialization in this. So there are people, those who apply actually that you have a degree at Calcutta University, okay. You have a degree from a Ranchi University, slightly lower down, so on and so forth. You have Delhi higher up. So we do these things in this way. So we will never get decolonization out of us until we realize what we're doing is what for the society and for yourself. So this is my humble submission to those who joined here, is that please think of what you're doing. Not that people say, how many articles you have published? 60. Oh, gee. So it's a quantity that matters. not the quality. I think we have to look back. I mean, I'm not Lala business, okay? Because I don't think India had caste or Hindu. Hindu, for the matter, is the name of the river Sindhu, which Iranian couldn't produce, so pronounced as Sindhu. And Sindhu again was pronounced by Indus, as Greeks did that. And from that came Hindu. There is no word Hindu in India. No word. No, it's like it's so that's how that performs. Hindu deliver.
Uh, Professor Badr, I can't actually hear you. Can you hear me? You can everyone can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I don't know what Professor Badra wants me to say, but I did hear a bit of what she was mentioning just now. Well, the only thing I can add is that we can't wait for the institutions to change. We can't wait for the institutions like the universities to adopt decolonization. For those of us who are somewhat free to teach the way we like to teach, then we should just do it ourselves, both formally in our classes, but also informally, perhaps, forming reading groups and um, discussing these issues and instilling this orientation of decolonizing knowledge among our students and among young people.
Hello.
Hello, Professor Adam, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, there was
Now I
some
can hear you
problem,
now.
some audio problem. The participants, can you hear me?
Yes.
Echo হচ্ছে। Somebody-
Talk through this. Talk through this.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. There is some audio problem. So I'm telling from my mobile that we had a great lecture and